Welcome to ORF Middle East. Firstly, we're all so delighted to have so many of you here with us today. So thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on unpacking Trump's Gulf tour. And we're also very delighted to actually co-host this session with the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. So I must thank Janardhan for all his support, for bringing this to life. We really appreciate that. For those of you who don't know much about ORF Middle East, don't worry, I'm not going to launch into a monologue, but do check us up online on our website. But this is actually our first public event that we're doing, and it's very special to us. And we are so honored to have such an esteemed panelists join us. So please welcome, Ambassador Mark Sievers. He is the director of the American Jewish Committee, the Sydney Lerner Center for Arab-Jewish Understanding in Abu Dhabi. We have Mr. Mohammed Baroon, Director General, Dubai Public Policy Research Center, Bahut. And of course, Dr. Janardhan, the Director of Research and Analysis and the Acting Academic Director at Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. So in terms of format, we thought we'll do like a really, a 40 to 45 minute panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a very quick Q&A. And I do want to maybe set a very brief context before we deep dive into the questions. In terms of questions, I have because I think it's such a well-representative panel, given we have an American, Emirati, and Janardhan, the balancing act here panel. I'll have a couple of blanket questions, and then I'd love to get the panel's perspective on each of those. So Trump recently concluded his three-nation tour of the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. And many are describing this in some sense as the Gulf reset. Given it's marked by such grand pageantry, headline-grabbing diplomacy in way, and also record-breaking commercial agreements, from the historic $600 billion investment from Saudi, about $1.2 trillion from Qatar, and of course, $200 billion in addition to the $1.2 trillion from the UAE. While oil and gas in many ways traditionally anchored the U.S. Gulf relations, this visit in some sense is, signaled a very decisive shift, a shift to a more commercial and business-oriented diplomacy, if I can say. One that no longer solely is defined by barrels alone, but by investments in energy infrastructure, in AI chips, in critical minerals, in computing power. And I think all the elements that in some sense will really define the future of global competitiveness. Besides the economics of the visit, I think the strategic, there was a lot of strategic geopolitical underpinning to the visit as well, especially, with Donald Trump's very landmark meeting in some sense with the head of state from Syria, conversations around Iran. So there were a lot of economic but also geopolitically strategic conversations that sort of underpinned his visit. So I think many are calling Trump's approach here not just intentionally disruptive, but also unapologetically transactional, right? Where, you give me capital and I'll give you access to my tech. So I think to kick us off, my first question to the panel would be your opening thoughts. What are the strategic and economic imperatives, in your opinion, that are driving or that sort of underpinned Trump's visit to the region? And how would you define that or mark that as being different from his predecessor, Biden's approach to diplomacy and to his approach to the region? So maybe we can start with you, Ambassador.
Sure. Thank you, Manat, and thanks to ORF for inviting me, and delighted to be here. This was an unusual visit, maybe not for President Trump. He has a certain style of doing things, but certainly for an American president, in that, as you mentioned, the rhetoric, the focus was very much on deals, as he likes to emphasize, the art of the deal. I think he is looking toward what we call the midterm elections in the Congress next year, a year from November, and trying to ensure that he maintains the support and the majorities that the Republicans won in last year's presidential elections. And a key part of that is demonstrating economic results in terms, and he's very much focused on jobs for Americans, about bringing back, the industrial manufacturing and other kinds of employment to the American economy that's been outsourced over the last 20 years or so, and sort of rebalancing the terms of trade around the world. And so this fits very nicely into that agenda. But what we don't hear, and I think he was quite explicit, I watched the whole speech that he gave at the Saudi U.S. investment conference in Riyadh on the first day of the visit. And he was very, very outspoken about how he sees his administration being different from several recent administrations in terms of, he was very, very critical of what he called interventionists, neocons, although I think the neocons kind of disappeared some time ago in American politics, but were certainly a force in the period after 9/11. And very much focused on, we don't judge other leaders by ideological terms. We look at what kind of arrangements we can make with them, and are they open for business and so forth. That's a very different approach. I think President Biden in particular was very much in his political rhetoric about the world. He was very much focused on a competition or even a challenge between democracies around the world and authoritarian systems of government. And I think Trump just said, no, that's not the priority of the United States under his leadership anyway. The priority is let's bring peace, let's make deals. And we also saw it in the decision to meet with the Syrian leader. I'm not sure exactly president's the right term, but and to announce the lifting of sanctions on Syria. I think that came at the request of the Saudi Crown Prince, but also of President Erdogan of Turkey. And it's obviously of interest to a lot of the European powers as well to stabilize Syria. So that perhaps refugee populations might go back. But that didn't seem to be the main driving force. It was showing that he respected and listened to the advice of local leaders. And if there's one thing that has been a source of criticism of the United States, in my experience over the last 20 years or more in this region, it's the sense that we like to tell people what we think they should do, but we're not very good at listening to what they think we should do. And I think he was turning that on its head.
Right. Mr. Baroon, your thoughts?
Well, I would possibly say the same thing, that Ambassador Sivas has said, maybe in different words, but expect a lot of complementarity here. But first of all, thank you for the invitation. Great to see as fabulous people on the crowd as much as on the panel. One thing I would say that which you've mentioned, the word reset. So what does the reset mean? If we're resetting something, that we're stopping something that was old, we're starting it all anew. So what is starting all anew? And I think that's what Ambassador Sivers has ended with, is that now we are listening to you. We don't see you as sort of recipients of orders. We do not see the world as we imagine it, and we expect you to follow suit and build that world based on our imagination. There is an acceptance of a different imagination of the world, and that this imagination can actually work. It's a visit that has changed us from the rhetoric of alliances, which is security-based. This is specific, country that is strong, that can provide security, a weaker country that needs it, and they will pay for it, into the concept of partnership. So the word partnership has emerged so many times and in so many different ways, and I think that's a major reset. In my view, this is not about the region. This is something that we will see across the world. It's a different one. The second reset is the change from geopolitics to geoeconomics. This is far more visible in this Trump's term than it was in the first term. And at this point, people say this is transactional, it's economic, it's trade. No, it's geoeconomics first, geopolitical second. This is practically one of the things that the UAE principles of the 50 comes up with. It's the second principle. We will put economy first because economy has to do with the welfare of the people. And then politics will serve it. And we see now a huge, I would say, understanding, mutual understanding, a better harmony in the view of the world than we used to with the US in the past. Our major discussions was always about security and defense because that's how the US have seen itself as a provider of security in this region. And an extremely telling number is the number of defense deals versus non-defense deals.
Yeah.
So that tells you that this is a totally different one. The second area is that there is also a trust in the experience. So you guys, you have been doing things so well, we don't need to tell you what to do. Actually, we might even support what you're trying to do. This is now evident in the the conversation engagement with Iran. It's based on the same type of conversation the Gulf has had with Iran, the de-escalation. Even the point of lifting the sanctions, this is an experiment. We see that you guys are trying to support it. Let me try and support it as well. Because as we've heard later on from Secretary Rubio, that Syria could actually go into some sort of a civil war. Yeah. And if economic support does not come in at the right time, it would be too late. So this is now an administration in the US that listens to the region, looks at what it's doing, and even supports those experiments. Maybe the experiment would fail, but they are willing now to put a skin into the game and say, let's see how far it would go. And I think this is far different from everything that we've seen in the past.
Got it. And Dr. Janardhan, your thoughts?
Yeah, so, I mean, again, not going to be very different from what they said, but sitting where I'm sitting and, I'm Indian head to toe, but I sort of wear an Emirati thinking cap. So I may bring a little of a different perspective. First, I think the major difference is that this was not about just America. Usually when the United States comes to this part of the world, it strikes deals that seem like it's more beneficial to the United States rather than to the region or to its partners. Yeah. But this seems like it is a win-win sort of situation. And more importantly, I think it has put the primacy of the Gulf right up there. I think that's really the key. This is, everybody's been talking about this being the Gulf moment, that Gulf is now the center of the Middle East, Arab world. I would take it one step further and say that actually this is the moment of the global Gulf. I don't think any part of the world can invest the sort of numbers that we heard. Yeah. Whether or not they will all materialize, that's for another day's discussion. Yeah. But the fact is, whether it's 2.4 billion that we are hearing from this part of a trillion that we are hearing from this part of the world, or whether Trump misread it and reads it the other way around and says 4.2 trillion, that's again debatable. But the fact is those numbers cannot be heard anywhere else in terms of investments. So the primacy of the Gulf is very important. It's not only global, it's about being market-driven, it's about being multi-networked, it's about being multi-aligned. All of those dynamics now really play out. So the primacy of the US, primacy of the Gulf more than the US. Focus on geoeconomics rather than geopolitics. Yes, there were, a lot of geopolitics discussed. But one thing is the sort of dehyphenation of the Middle East from Israel and the rest. I think that's important to note. There was very little about Israel during this trip. Yeah. Usually, it's Israel first, and the other countries are packed around it. But in this case, it was the Gulf first, and there was very little about Israel. Third thing is, I think it's also about conditionality. And this is somehow linked to the first point that I made about the primacy of the Gulf. The conditionality is very important. I don't think much is spoken about in public, but given the nature of diplomacy and confidence that the Gulf countries have now, they are not going to just sit and wait for the United States to do what it wants. there will be some set conditions. You deliver on this. So, for example, I would like to believe that some of the things that were struck in terms of the economic deals are linked to US delivering on the political issues. So they must have really, I think they've invested heavily and bought peace. And that's the way I would like to see it. They've literally bought peace. And it also seems like the cost of peace is more than cost of war, just in terms of the amount of money that they put in. So I think the conditionality is important. They're not going to just let the United States do what it wants to do moving forward. The fourth thing that I want to suggest is also that this is not a typical US model of striking deals. The US is used to giving its wish list and getting what it wants. I think in this case, it was more of a Asian-styled deal making. Because if you look at the growth of Gulf-Asia relations in the last 20 years in the region, it's more about staying away from politics, staying away from dictating terms, telling them what to do and what not to do. None of that really happened this time. And the sort of things that both Mark and Mohammed alluded to is that there was a sense of autonomy to the Gulf countries to fashion themselves the way they want, do it your way. We are no one to dictate terms to you. And that's exactly how Asia's relations with this part of the world grew over the last 20 years. Stay away from politics. Economic sense is common sense. And that's precisely, I think, what Trump brought to the table. Lastly, I think it moved away from the old paradigm of oil for security sort of deals. Yes. I mean, 1980, Qatar's deal in this part of the world was all about you provide us with oil and we'll provide you security. There were a few energy deals, but I don't think energy was the front, left, and center of it all. I think it was completely different, and it put technology at the center of everything. The intersection between technology and international relations couldn't have been more pronounced than what happened, and I think the Gulf wants to capitalize. Data is the new oil, as they say, and I think they're going to capitalize on this moving forward.
Right. In fact, we just come out with a piece on the trip and the visit. And one of the things that I've mentioned is the energy diplomacy was very tech infused. So it was a very quiet, understated energy diplomacy that we witnessed this time round. I think I'm just going to very quickly reiterate the pointers. So clearly the imperatives ranged for Trump in terms of energy security, increase FDI inflow and job creation. So I think these were the driving factors for Trump's visit in the region. There was more listening and less imposing. As Mr. Baroon said, geoeconomics trumped geopolitics in many ways. There is a global Gulf moment that we see where Gulf is not just a rising power, an emerging actor in the region in the Middle East, but also more so in the global world order. And I think lastly, it's important to know the conditionality that you mentioned, that there will be a quid pro quo, there is a transactionalism, not just from the Trump end, but also from leaders in this part of the world who want an equal bargaining sort of hand in the deals. I think coming to my next question, like one of you also mentioned that we did see a sense of withdrawal or moving away, a very strategic, intentional moving away from Trump, from Biden's very subsidy-heavy industrial policy approach to a more commercial, business and market-friendly approach towards diplomacy. And one of the things, in some sense, that we also did notice is and I think the fact that the withdrawal of the semiconductor trade restrictions is clearly a case in point. But that was also in some way to sort of curb China's influence in the region, right? Today, Beijing is one of the biggest partners for the Middle East. Almost 1/3 of the DFI is is from Beijing, is from China. How do you think the region and the leaders in the Gulf countries are going to really balance this diplomatic act between Washington and Beijing, and how do you see that playing out? So, Ambassador, maybe you could get us started.
Sure. I mean, that's a very important question. I thought one thing that struck me from the visit, maybe I missed it, but I saw very few, if any, direct references to China in any of the public discussions. Obviously, there must have been some discussions behind the scenes, and the China factor has a lot to do with, addressing it has a lot to do with the decision to reach the deal here on the AI, the vast AI campus and partnership and so forth. But I recall very clearly the first few years that I spent in the the UAE starting in August of 2021. Much of what I heard was, well, we want to be free to, pick this from the US and that from China, and we'll have a defense relationship with the United States, but we need to be able to have whatever kind of technology agreements that we want to have with China. I think that's changing. I'm not sure that's permanent. I'm not sure how all of this works out through the American political system, which is very complicated with the role of Congress and so forth. But I see a shift, a decision that at least in the technology field, that the partner of choice is the United States. And I think that was already underway in the second half of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
But I see it, reinforced very much by Sheikh Tahnoon's visit to Washington earlier this year, and then all over, not just in the UAE, but also in Qatar, which also has an interest in AI, and in Saudi Arabia in different ways.
Right. Mr. Baroon, do you think the Teslas will manage to keep up with the aggressive expansion of BYDs in the region?
I think the majority of the Tesla sold here are made in China. But
It is complicated.
I agree with Ambassador Sievers. There hasn't been a lot of discussion publicly about China. And yes, there might have been discussions, internally, but the lack of public discourse position on China during the visit, I think it itself is quite important. The second thing is that the US has been doing a lot, in the negotiation with China and Geneva. And I think that is also adding to the idea is that, at least as far as I understand, the US wants a fairer trade with China. And at least in my view, it wants a fairer access to rare earth minerals from China. And I think that is good for the whole economy. But again, as mentioned, this has been very tech heavy, particularly AI heavy. AI is not only the software or the semiconductors that feed into it, it's users. Where are the majority of the users, the biggest population bulbs in the world? They are Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That's the global south.
Yeah.
So we cannot really say we're going to develop AI away from China, because we need the Chinese users, end of the day. Any AI platform that does not have many users is possibly not going to go for, because it's all based on machine learning. Yeah. And there will be not enough users to feed into it. So I don't think it is something that the US, and I think that is why we don't need a very strong discourse about it. It's not about taking China out of the equation. On the flip side, the UAE companies partnering with the US are partnering with the top technology providers. What if those top technology providers in the next 10 years will come from China? Does that mean that the US would say, no, we have an allegiance to the US, we will not touch Chinese technology? I don't think that's going to be the case. Because end of the day, it's a political approach to technology. At this point, it makes a lot of sense for UAE companies to partner with American companies. In the same way, it makes a lot of sense for the UAE to invest in the AI sector in India, as much as in China. It's the proportion of what do I need, when, and where. So I don't think that the decision or the lack of the discussion, the partnership, AI partnership with the US is 100% a seclusion, separation, divorce from the Chinese technology.
So it's not exclusive. And I think I echo what you say, that we need to really democratize the conversation, the narrative, and also usage and access to these technologies. But Janardhan, to you.
Yeah, look, I'm not so surprised that China was not mentioned as part of all the discussions that took place, simply because I think this visit and deals was all about countering China in the first place. So the United States came with that sort of an agenda, largely. I think they wanted to make it big. And to a large extent, I think the US was playing catch up, given China already having made great inroads into this part of the world. I mean, just look at the numbers, right? we have something like $250 billion worth of GCC China trade figures.
Yeah.
And the United States is about $60 billion. So it really is playing catch-up game. So China must have been thinking, well, it's all about us in terms of whatever the US is doing. Plus, let's also not forget that it's a much flatter world. So I think these deals don't represent that the US is really making a comeback. The US is really making is playing a catch-up game, and there will be ample space. The world is really big enough. We keep talking about it in India, that there's the world is big enough for both China and India to play their roles. And I think the world is big enough for the Gulf to utilize both the United States and China. And they've demonstrated it. I think what it really does is it helps the UAE and the Gulf countries to sort of extract more out of them. I keep saying this. It's no longer a system in the world where the bigger powers milk the smaller powers. It's a system where the smaller powers can milk the bigger powers. And I think the UAE and the Gulf countries are going to keep using United States and China, both providers. I mean, Chinese technology, we may not like it in India, but or in the United States, but Chinese technology, by virtue of DeepSeek proves that they're good enough. They're not too far behind United States technology. So there will be ample scope. What China cannot provide this part of the world, the United States will provide. What United States fails to provide, because again, I talked about conditionalities. There's still a long way to go before United States can actually deliver on all the promises it's made, given its political system, given the Congress approvals that are required, all of these things. So if they don't get it from here, they'll still go back to China. They've done it. Because remember the F-35 deal when UAE suspended talks with the United States, the very next day they placed an order for some trainer jets. It may have been symbolic, but they did place an order for 10 trainer jets from China. So I think they're going to use these things moving forward. And so China being left out is really not a surprise.
Right. I think what was striking from the comments and remarks was that it's interesting how the emerging powers are actually going to be milking the bigger powers going forward. And I think it would be interesting to see how that plays out for this part of the world. I think on the role of external actors, I think now coming to the two big, parties or two big countries that were in some sense conspicuously absent from the conversations and discourse was Israel and Russia. So what are your thoughts on that? Ambassador, maybe we start with you again.
I think I'd like to point out that one of the first things that President Trump said in his remarks in Riyadh was that he wants to see normalization of Saudi Arabia's relations with Israel. He emphasized that very strongly. And he also said, I think, acknowledging reality, addressing himself directly to Mohammed bin Salman, of course, you will do this in your own time when you're ready, because I think we all appreciate that it can't be done very quickly at this stage of things. But I thought that was quite an important statement, and that he could have said that behind closed doors or sort of in a different context, but it was right almost front and center in his remarks in Riyadh in that first speech. So I think that was quite significant. And I think it's also, you can't look at the region today without acknowledging what Israel has done to reshape the region strategically. Shara would not be ruling in Damascus had Israel not taken apart power of Hezbollah in Lebanon and by extension in Syria, or reduced Iran's capacity to project force into Lebanon through Syria. So that is also part of the context. But it does appear that at least for this purposes of this visit, that Israel was not front and center. It was about the United States and the Gulf. I think that's understood in Israel, but they are also looking for some reassurance at this point from Washington that nothing fundamental has changed. As for Russia, I know there's a lot of diplomatic activity on behalf of supporting ceasefire negotiations that involves the Gulf, at least as good offices and diplomatic platforming. Also Turkey, but that is not primarily a regional issue. And my sense is that Russia's significance as a security partner has been severely set back, first by the complexity of the war in Ukraine and what's that, what that has done for the image of Russian capabilities. And secondly, by the loss of their partner in Syria, which is their primary regional partner for many, many years, generations, has been the Assad family in Damascus, and they're gone.
Mr. Barun, over to you.
I think on Syria, I would say, no, sorry, on Israel, I would say it's part of this change from geoeconomics to geopolitics. Because if you look at politics, Israel should have been the number one station for any visit to the Middle East. But if you're changing to geoeconomics, what is Israel providing the US when it comes to geoeconomics? Nothing much. So this is a new change. If we take that this is an actual shift in the mentality, then this actually proves that shift. It doesn't mean that the US is not, interested in Israel anymore. I don't think this is the case at all. But I think when it comes to the plans for making America great again, it would possibly start from the countries who are willing, capable of spreading stability in the region, including in places like Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and Israel. Now, that is the new direction. I think this is the tacit message to Israel. This is the new world we're living in. It's a world of economic prosperity. We need stability for that. You need to start hopping onto that train. Unfortunately, the response from Israel was the Gideon chariots, which is not really the type of response the US wants. And I don't think even the type of response anyone else in the world wants. But again, this is a duality. I don't think that duality in the mind of Benjamin Netanyahu and other members of the government right now has cleared up to see that there is a shift. It's like moving away from, old classical printers to digital printing. It's a big shift. Those printers are possibly going to go away. And if a deal actually happens between the US and Iran, we will see the implications of that, because Iran will open up to everyone and the flow of trade will possibly go to Central Asia and all the way to Russia. Russia would want to use that type of corridor all the way to Asian markets, African markets, and Latin American markets. This is a big shift. Unfortunately, I don't hear anyone in Israel today, those at least that I discuss with, are aware that this shift is happening. They're still saying, Israel doesn't want peace, it wants security. It's an old matrix, it's dying, and I'm afraid that there will be there's a need for regeneration inside Israel.
Right. So I think a foreign policy which is less value-based and more dictated by economic statecraft, right, is, I think, the takeaway here. Janardhan, your quick thoughts on this?
Yeah, again, just like China, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but we shouldn't be too surprised. Why should Russia be part of this discussion at all in any form? Israel, yes, is a bit surprising, but I think we really shouldn't be making a big issue out of Israel being left out, because what would have been the main factors on which Israel could have been major part of Trump's visit here? Could they have announced a ceasefire? No. Could they have announced a two-state solution? No. So why even talk about it? Could they have announced a normalization with Saudi Arabia? He started off with that he would like to see it happening, but in good time. That's it. And so I think the front and center was all about the Gulf countries. But Israel is going to be a very important player in the region. Israel is a very important partner, an ally of the United States. So I don't think any of its interests is really messed up in terms of, Trump focusing on the Gulf. And Israel will remain relevant because it's part of Abraham Accords, of which the Gulf is a major part, of which the US is major part, of I2U2, of IMEC, and all of these things. So Israel not being left out shouldn't be exaggerated. Russia, again, irrespective of Russia not being mentioned, the relevance of Russia to the region is important. Yes, in terms of trade numbers, I think it's only at about 10 or 15 billion or something around those lines. So no comparison with India, China, or South Korea, or Japan, or any of these countries. But I think Russia brings to the table many factors which are not very well recognized in this part of the world. I think it's a major part of oil price mechanism. So Russia's cooperation with this part of the world is very important. That will continue. Investments. There have been some big ticket investments in the last few years that the UAE and the Russians have made. That will continue. I think it also gives them space by virtue of the UAE being part of BRICS and other such entities to be involved with Russia. UAE is greatly involved in the Russia-Ukraine prisoner exchange and mediation efforts. Those will continue. So Russia is, again, a major part of it. And don't forget that while the rest of the world has sort of sanctioned Putin, he arrived here a few years ago and went on to Saudi Arabia. So he will remain a major partner of this part of the world. Last but not the least, I don't know if I'm sticking my neck out here, but I sense that there could be something also linked to Iran, just in terms of how there could be some backdoor negotiations between the United States and Russia about how the United States will complete the deal with Ukraine on behalf of Russia if Russia helps achieve some sort of a nuclear deal with Iran in this part of the world. Just a wild thought.
Wow, that's an interesting theory that we can play with later. But I think I agree. And I want to maybe quote Mr. Bharun from a different panel, which was that my friend may not be your friend and my foe may not be your foe anymore. So I think that dynamic is significantly changed, and that sort of is redefining how we look at diplomacy and foreign policy in ways today. And I think to your point about how Trump only suggesting, the fact that Saudi should perhaps join Abraham Accords is that there is, and instead of imposing, as you said, I think they're listening more, and there is an element of egalitarianism and partnership in this equation, which then again, I think alludes to the point Janardhan made about the global Gulf, or about Gulf being a big power today in the global dynamic, which is beyond oil and beyond, oil productions and barrel. I think next I want to maybe touch upon Syria. I know we've spoken about this, but in a little different context, which is, so Syria was a bit of a shocker, right? Like, it was a bit shocking to see. In some sense, it was considered a very landmark meeting, because apparently this is the first time in 25 years that Syrian and a US head of state have met. So that was a bit of a shocking kind of a meeting as well. And symbolically, in some sense, hosted in Riyadh does signal Saudi's very emerging role as a regional mediator. So while that's happening on one end, the fact that US also did greenlight the civil nuclear energy deal with Saudi to, in again some sense, counterbalance and counteract Iran's nuclear trajectory, it also shows its rising sort of balancing act that it is being able to play. So I think my question really is, how do you see Saudi's role as a power broker, as a regional mediator, and how will Saudi really take on that leadership role in the Gulf, and how will that impact its relationship with other countries in the Middle East and other Gulf countries?
Well, first, I think we need to be clear that Gulf states don't all have exactly the same view about Syria or about the new governing body. I don't even call it a government, because it doesn't extend its control over a large part of Syria's territory. But it is sort of the only cohesive governing body in the country at this point. There clearly are different opinions about the extent to which this new Syrian leadership is trustworthy. We saw the statement by His Highness Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed here about trust but verify with regard to the Syrian leadership. I think it's a nuanced difference, but there is a difference here from the Saudi position. But the Saudis were the ones who were able to bring about that meeting, which was quite surprising. I was actually a bit surprised at the end of the Biden administration that the administration sent the Assistant Secretary, the former ambassador here, Barbara Leaf, to Damascus to meet Mohammed Shara when there was a great deal of reservation still in Washington about engaging with him and with his governing body. So for the President of the United States to greet him, shake his hand, speak to him directly, that was a bit of a shock, I think. I understand it was largely a gesture to the Saudis and as I said, to the Turkish President Erdogan. We'll have to wait and see what comes of that, because Syria is a very, very complicated question, and sadly the country's really been ripped apart internally for the last 15 years or so, and it will take time to recover from that. Lifting U.S. sanctions is meant to be a part of a broader effort to stabilize Syria. I hope it works. We'll see. I just want to make one quick remark about Israel. I think Israel has not rejected peace. Israel needs security. The president has been very clear, and I think voices in the region are very clear, that the solution in Gaza has to involve disarming Hamas, returning the hostages, and removing what's left of the Hamas leadership from Gaza. Without that, I don't see how this war comes to an end.
Right. Mr. Barun, your thoughts?
I would, there's a big controversy very recently that culminated today regarding the relationship of Ambassador Ford to Shar. The fact that he has met him twice, once when he was a jihadist and later on after he...
Yes.
Out of government, I believe, right? After he left government.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
Ambassador Ford.
No, he met him before as when he was, I think, in government.
When he was still in the State
Yes.
Department, really?
And he met him later on after government. But in both cases, that has left or led a source within the Syrian government to deny that President Shara has met him before. This is a controversy that has to do with the fact that the U.S. have dealt with Shara and HTS in a different manner than they've dealt with others, including Taliban. There was an agreement with Taliban, but we haven't seen CNN going and conduct an interview with any of their leaders. Same thing with Iraq, same thing in other places. It was the exception where the U.S. is rightfully, no European leader or government would have went to Damascus had, Ambassador Barbara Leaf went there and actually, not only that she went there, she stayed in Jordan to manage day-to-day issues when it comes to so there was an investment from the American government, and I don't think that what we've seen is a huge departure from what we've seen before. The fact that it came in the context of Saudi. Now, on your question on the Saudi leadership, I think it's very much welcome because pretty much this is the Gulf. This is the new Gulf, the global Gulf, as Dr. Janardhan has mentioned. And I think a lot of people at the beginning thought that Saudi Arabia was practically trying to compete with Turkey over some sort of either dominance or influence in Syria. But what they've asked for, which is lifting the sanctions, is exactly what they have asked for before, along with the UAE, Egypt, and others, to lift the sanction on Syria during Assad's time. So the idea was focusing on Syria because that is the disintegration that is happening. The bureaucracy does not belong to either Assad or Shar. Bureaucracy is important because these are the legs on which any state would stand. So I think this is the importance over there. There is no school that can be built or a hospital or a road since those sanctions are on. Taking them off, I think, will give the Syrian people before Shar. Now, does the Shar has got legitimacy inside Syria? In my view, in the streets, he's got some sort of legitimacy. It's not a full legitimacy that comes out of ballot box if that's the only source of legitimacy. But right now, he is capable of maintaining the situation without exploding. And I think that is the best type of legitimacy in a torn, in a conflict-torn country like Syria. Can he continue doing this or not? That's a different issue. But I think in our best interest today is that Syria doesn't disintegrate. In the same way, our best interest today is for Iran also not to disintegrate, because the impact of that disintegration is going to affect the whole region.
So regional stability is key and should be the driving factor.
Absolutely.
Janardhan?
Yeah, to the point that the Gulf countries are very different today, I often joke that it's not the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, it's the Gulf Competition Council.
I like that.
Just short of confrontation, they're really competing with each other. Just like the United States is playing a catch-up game here in the Gulf, I think Saudi Arabia is also in some ways trying to play a catch-up game in Syria. UAE will have to play a bigger catch-up game in Syria, just by virtue of Turkey and Qatar being in pole position in terms of benefiting from the regime change that has taken place in Syria. It's all about commercial interests at the end of the day. Political stability is important, but it's about commercial interests. About 10 years ago, I think the UAE's first delegation to Syria was not a political delegation, but a business delegation. Most of the people from Dubai were actually part of the delegation in terms of seeing how, if and when there is Syria coming back to the Arab fold, into the international fold, how can the UAE be part of the reconstruction process in Syria? I think right now, that's the sort of competition also that's taking place in terms of who gets those big deals. Qatar and Turkey pole position, Saudi Arabia there, UAE next. All of them want to ensure that they're part of the reconstruction process. And let's not forget that I think somewhere there is a great deal of dilution of ideology. It's also a way of trying to bring to the mainstream some of these extremist elements, some of these political Islam elements, which were being resisted for the last decade and a half. But if they are coming back to the fore in a different form, and that's the only way you can achieve political stability and ensure your growth, so bring them on. It's a bit like what they did with Taliban as well. Taliban is now an accepted factor. You're doing the same with Shara all over again. And so I sometimes really wonder, while others seem to be learning lessons, maybe Israel could also learn some lessons in terms of co-opting some of the extremist elements, trying to ensure peace. He was talking about land for peace or land for security. I think it's what comes first. Do you have to wait for peace for economic growth, or can you bring in the economic dynamics and achieve some sort of peace? I think that's the sort of trade-off that Israel could also make, learning from the reconciliation that is taking place in the region. Iran was left in the cold for some time, brought back into the mainstream by the GCC countries. Syria, the same case. Taliban, all of these things. I think there's some lessons to learn for not just Israel, many other countries which are having different issues with their neighbors and other extremist elements.
Right. And I'll also add the example of Iran. I mean, I think the whole normalization with Iran, of course, is important from a regional stability point of view, but also it's a very gas-rich country. And I think the United States understands the economics of being able to have good relations with them in the long term.
One of the things that the Iranian foreign minister mentioned in his letter to the US president was that, I'm sorry, there's some sort of problem in terms of understanding the relationship. We are not close to American businesses coming to Iran. It's America which is close to doing business with Iran. We are ready to put in. We are ready with $500 billion worth of business. I think they're also playing to the Trump's plan, the art of the deal,
the economic statecraft, right? So that's clearly leading the way. But I think moving away from this, who's catching up to whom, and this game of cat and mouse, I think coming to the more economic cooperation concept, right? Today, we're at a time where geopolitically it's been a whirlwind. There is global competition is just intensifying in different parts of the world. And the post-Bretton Woods institutions are struggling to really keep pace with those geopolitical changes. Do you believe that minilateral frameworks, like we've referenced to the I2U2, the IMEC, can they play a very important role in bridging certain gaps and promoting energy cooperation, tech cooperation? Can we ring fence some of these agendas for changes in government, changes in regional stabilities, and really push for greater cooperation on energy, on climate, on technology, and really unlock stronger avenues for economic growth and prosperity for the region and its people? So, Ambassador,
Let me try that one. Yes, I think we see enormous potential in the IMEC concept. I2U2 sort of is stalled with the Gaza war, but the concept is still there and still valid. And I do think these smaller groupings and more focused groupings may be better mechanisms than global institutions that right now seem fairly dysfunctional.
Yeah.
So yes, and bringing India very much is already connected with the Gulf, but tying it even more closely to Europe through the Middle East, through the Gulf, and as with the IMEC conference across the Mediterranean, perhaps from the port of Haifa, is a fantastic idea with enormous potential. It will take time. It can't be. A lot of issues have to be resolved before it becomes a practical reality. But I think it's something that deserves a lot of effort to try to keep it moving in wherever there are specific issues that can be addressed now, while keeping the whole concept valid. So, yeah.
Right. Mr. Baroon, and if you could also maybe highlight those challenges, like the ambassador said, right? What are those challenges that is precluding progress in being able to fructify and accelerate such minilateral frameworks?
Well, I think in this duality we're talking about, the biggest challenge is conflicts. That would leads to instability. Sorry, instability affects people. Thank you. Affects the ability for states to interact. I want to highlight this point of Syria. Syria is actually a mega connector because it connects to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Israel, and Jordan.
Yeah.
So whatever stability that we bring into Syria will allow us to implement the connectivity agenda. And it's not surprising that the UAE involvement right now, I think there will be more, is on ports and airlines.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to connect Syria to the world and make sure that there is far more importance to world economy on Syria. So the decision that leaders inside Syria will take, it's not because of their ideology or their just immediate neighbor. They will have to think about the implication of the world economy that they would have. I think this is one of the reasons why, for instance, today, nobody's talking about using the weapon of oil or an oil boycott in the issue of Gaza. Because if we do that today, who's going to be affected? India, China, Korea, Japan, they have nothing to do with the problem. It doesn't make any sense to affect world economy and energy supply all over the world just because of a conflict in Gaza. But that doesn't mean it's not important. But I think this is the way we're thinking about Syria today. And I think those formations you've mentioned, the fact that Syria wanted the UAE to take care of Tartus port is that because they want to think of themselves as a possible outlet for IMEC. Now we've got 3 inlets from coming from India into the Arabian Peninsula, which is Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Oman.
Yeah.
We cannot have only one outlet, which is Haifa. We need others. So this is one. Beirut could be another, and I think possibly even Gaza could be.
Excellent. Dr. Janardhan,
I'm a great votary of unilateralism.
Yes.
Simply because I believe that there are some limitations, or rather, we are perhaps seeing some sort of saturation with many of the bilateral relations between countries. Multilateralism is certainly not working very well. So you need a new form of diplomacy. And I myself am a very unstructured person. So I like unilateralism because it's very unstructured. There are no rules, there's no secretariat, there's no somebody watching over you and telling you what's right and what's wrong. It's a very flexible system. It's nimble. It's more, economy driven. Like I2U2, many of them say it's Quad, sorry, there's no security dynamics in that. There's more, it's a partnership for the future. These sort of things, and most importantly, you can walk in and walk out whenever you want. You like the system, be part of it. You don't like it, walk out of it. And what it does to emerging powers is that it breaks the old world. You started off by saying about Bretton Woods institutions. We have no place in those institutions, right? I mean, neither bigger countries in terms of size, not small countries which are punching above their weight like the Gulf countries. So what minilateral groupings provide for them is what I say as both not just being on the menu or being at the table, but being on the menu and at the table both. I think they get the sort of voice, respect, which they don't get in multilateral institutions. And these are, young adults, adolescents moving into adulthood, and they need that space, and only minilateral institutions provide that space. So watch that space. I think there's going to be a lot more in terms of those groupings gaining currency in the years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's flexible, it's nimble, it's agile, and I think most of all is well represented.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think the fact that it has a good balance of a developing country, emerging economies, and the developed world. So it's very egalitarian in its approach, which is going to be the way we want to craft our future. I want to go to the audience for like a couple of questions really quickly. So maybe we'll take about 2 to 3 questions in one go, and then we can come back to the panel for their closing thoughts and remarks. So thank you. So just I think really quickly to reiterate, one, why did we choose these 3 countries? Why not the other countries in the Gulf? So was there any strategic reason for that? The Iran question, I know we briefly covered that, but maybe if anyone of you wants to elaborate. Does the Gulf-US relationship in some sense alter the donor-recipient relationship, particularly when it comes to Africa? And I think lastly, the Iraq question. So maybe we'll take about 1 minute each for the responses, and this could also be your closing remarks. So why don't we start with you, Ambassador, as always, since you were
really quickly. I had Maddie, I had exactly the same question about the Gulf Summit. I don't know if anyone knows if there were bilateral meetings with the leaders of the other 3 states. That would be interesting. I couldn't see any reference to it, and I did find it a bit puzzling. It seemed to be an assertion of Saudi leadership of the Gulf, which is, not always welcomed by the smaller countries in the GCC. But as my friend Dr. Janardhan said, it may be now the Gulf Competition Council, not the Cooperation Council. So that, and I'll skip to Iraq and then I'll stop. I think Iraq is the real absent party in this. Iraq is still potentially a country of great significance with a huge culture and history and oil and agricultural land and industrial capacity and educated population. And it still suffers from 2 things. One, internal political chaos and mismanagement, maybe 3 things. Iranian penetration and influence peddling that is not necessarily in Iraq's interest. And then lastly, sadly, I would say that the United States seems to have lost interest. It was a painful experience for a lot of people, and they may just not want to be reminded of it. So I'm very sorry to say that. I hope that can be overcome.
Mr. Barun.
Okay, I don't have any information about the bilateral meetings between the Gulf state leaders after that, but the fact that there was a GCC summit, not an Arab summit or an Islamic summit, I think speaks that this is a GCC focus. On Iran, I think the question originally on Syria and Iran not featuring because there were rumors that there could be either a meeting from President Putin with President Trump in Riyadh, or a meeting from Kazakhstan with President Trump. And neither of them happened, but it doesn't mean that Iran was not featured. I think Gulf leaders, particularly here in the UAE, have enforced the fact that they're supporting the negotiations right now, and they're hoping that it would lead to some sort of an understanding. On Africa, I think we're trying to have a different model than the Chinese model and the European model. And I think that is possibly the most obvious mark of how we're doing, or how we're looking at Africa. It's a very difficult environment, particularly when you look at multilaterals. If you work with IGAD, then you're not working with others. So I think bilateral until now is the main. There is a view for trilateral, where 2 or 3 countries can come in and work on a subject, on a project. One very evident project is this partnership with the US, with Microsoft in Kenya. And that's on AI and application. So it's that type of approach. On Iraq, I think Iraq preceded all of them. The GCC outreach to Iraq started before its outreach to Lebanon or Syria. And I think it still is happening. Maybe the question I had is the type of representation at the summit. But we also understand that the summit is coming something like a few months, 6 or 7 months before the next election. And that means that whatever big event in the summit can be used for electioneering. And usually the GCC stays away from that. But I think Iraq is very important. Particularly UAE and Qatar are investing in the development road, which connects Iraq to Turkey to Europe. Saudi is investing a lot in the connectivity of the grid. And I think if there is reform inside Iraq, you will see far more investment. But there are a lot of reform that is needed, but both on the reforms on political aspect, but also on the security aspect. This has been the big problem that hasn't been solved, and I haven't seen Mohammed Shia Sudani taking the mantle of saying, "I'm going to be the one who actually he allowed it to metamorphosize the way it is happening right now." But we're hoping that we will see more from that.
I think you've addressed the GCC and the Iraq question. Let me just delve into the relationship, donor, recipient sort of. I think there's a lot of change that's happening, right? I mean, today recipients are becoming donors. I think that's a big change that's taking place around the world. I mean, India is a classic example. India refused to accept donations from the UAE about 10 years ago, saying that we are no longer a recipient country, we are actually a donor country, so thank you very much. That's point number one. Point number two, I think it's also very important to see the sort of change that's taking place when it comes to dealing with Africa. My problem has always been that West was too involved with aid in Africa for far too long as a way of making up for their past sins. But aid actually has no accountability. So the sort of model that Asia adopted with Africa in terms of trade is done far better for Africa than aid has done in the past. So I think that's the sort of model that this part of the world will continue. And if you have noticed in the last few years, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, all of them have told the world that their aid is not going to be without strings attached. It'll all come with strings attached. I think that's a key point to remember. And these are sort of grants. They're not really loans that can be written off in the long term. They're making investments because they see potential for returns. And I think they will ensure that those investments are pretty well maintained. And again, sticking my neck out, the US has been left behind in Africa as well for far too long. And I suspect that the trilateral mechanism that has been working pretty well with Gulf and some of the Asian countries and maybe even America now, the Kenya project, that will be replicated a little more. If the West wants to come back in Africa in some form, be it United States or Europe, it has to be piggy riding on the backs of the GCC countries because they have the capital, the West has some sort of mechanisms which they could utilize in the African market or in the Latin American market.
Right. And I hope we get to unpack a lot of that in our successive sessions. But thank you so much to our panelists for their time and for their very insightful analysis. We did manage to unpack a lot, so I'm very grateful. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.